So let's talk first about monogamy as a form of creating meaning. Sometimes people say that monogamy is outdated. And I don't think it's necessarily outdated. I think it's a container. And the question is, what do we fill that container with? At its best, monogamy is about devotion to a person. And it's the radical act of choosing the same person again and again. And not because you must, but because you want to. But when monogamy becomes unconscious, like a default, it's an expectation, that's where it can venture into monotony. And monotony suffocates desire because it sucks all the oxygen out of the room. Welcome to the Intimate Philosopher, where philosophy meets intimacy and life's biggest questions finally feel at home. I'm Dr. Emma Smith. I'm a licensed professional counselor, certified sex therapist, and existential philosophy nerd, inviting you to join me for an after-hours conversation. This is a space to slow down, pour a glass of wine, or maybe a cup of tea, and explore the messy, beautiful intersections of meaning, connection, desire, and being fully human. This is the place for real conversations about the parts of life that don't fit neatly into a box. So grab your glass, get comfy, and let's dive in. Hi, friends, and welcome back to The Intimate Philosopher. A lot of people ask me questions about relationship structures. Should we be monogamous or not? Should we try to open up our relationship? And in my work, to be fair, I have seen couples in every kind of structure. And in those containers, there are some who feel deeply connected. And then there are others who, regardless of the number of people in their relationships, still feel completely alone. So today, we're not debating relationship styles. We're going to talk about something deeper. And we're going to do this in the container of the most common relationship structure that we have, which is still monogamy. And we're going to talk about how to salvage monogamous relationships from becoming monotonous and why it's so important to use our sense of curiosity to make sure that we're continuing to cultivate desire and connection within that relationship. You ready? Let's dive in. As humans, we crave both freedom and belonging. We want to be chosen. We don't like being confined. We often want the stability of home, but we also crave the thrill of possibility. And somewhere between those two poles, we build our relationships. Some people find a lot of safety in monogamy, and others find expansion in openness. But the question isn't really about which structure is right. And, some of you are going to want to fight me on this, but I have truly seen it all: monogamy, polyamory, relationships that spend seasons in each, relationships that profess one thing publicly and live another in their private lives. So again, the question isn't about the structure. The question is, what is driving our choices within whatever container we choose? And are we choosing consciously, or are we choosing by cultural default? As we kind of set up to have this conversation, it's important to take a look at, the way that we love is shaped by so many external factors: culture, trauma, family styles, philosophy, even the economy. And for centuries, monogamy was a survival strategy, not a love story. But as our lives evolve, so do our expectations. As Esther Perel points out, and this was in one of her TED Talks that I absolutely love, she points out kind of very unromantically that one of the problems with relationships, and one of the problems that we're seeing today, and why, divorce rates are going up and whatnot, is that we live longer and we expect more from our partnerships than ever before. I mean, between the Middle Ages to the mid to late 18th century, okay, the average life expectancy was 35. How much did you have to love and like want to develop a permanent relationship with that person if the average life expectancy was 35, right? But now people live into their 70s, 80s, 90s. And so, yeah, it takes a lot more work to be with somebody over a much longer period of time and many different phases of life. And we also expect more from our relationships. We expect companionship, we expect security, we expect, excitement. And so our questions about intimacy need to evolve. What does forever mean when we keep changing? What does commitment mean when freedom also feels sacred? These are all really important things for us to explore. Before we go any deeper, I want to ask you something. I'm creating a private experience for ambitious couples, the kind who win in business but also refuse to feel flat at home. And I am not building this from theory. I am going to build this from real pain points. So I want to hear from you. Please go to my Instagram and send me a DM with the answer to this question. What is one thing that is quietly eroding the connection in your marriage or long term relationship? And don't feel confined to only give me the obvious answer. Give me the real one. Is it exhaustion? Is it a sense of control or a lack of control? Is it resentment? Is it just, the kids and desire fading because you don't get to spend any time together until it's 10:30 at night, and by that point you're exhausted? Whatever it is, tell me what's actually getting in the way, and I promise you I will read every message personally. Okay, thanks. Let's get back to the show. So let's talk first about monogamy as a form of creating meaning. Sometimes people say that monogamy is outdated. And I don't think it's necessarily outdated. I think it's a container. And the question is, what do we fill that container with? At its best, monogamy is about devotion to a person. And it's the radical act of choosing the same person again and again. And not because you must, but because you want to. But when monogamy becomes unconscious, like a default, it's an expectation, that's where it can venture into monotony. And monotony suffocates desire because it sucks the oxygen out of the room. Picture this. You're sitting across from each other at dinner. It's the same restaurant you always go to, and it's the same conversation that you're having about the kids, the schedule, the logistics. And at some point, you realize as you look up that you haven't actually seen this person in months. Most people don't lose desire for their partner, they lose curiosity. And the antidote to monotony, when we fall into these patterns, it's not it's not about novelty in the form of a new person. Like I feel like, it gets framed that way. But truly, it's actually, even with a new person, the mechanisms of what would be happening can be replicated with the partner that you already have. The difference is that you don't have curiosity about the partner that you already have. Every once in a while, I will get a couple in my office and they are caught in this cycle of, just kind of passive existence that is somehow peppered with criticism and defensiveness. And something really interesting happens because one of them feels like they already know what the other one is going to say. Well, I don't have to be curious about this person. I already know what they're going to say. And almost without fail, the other person feels entirely misrepresented and misunderstood. Well, how the heck can that be? Right? How can you know someone to the point of exhaustive, dispassionate uh, monotony, right? And at the same time, be so off the mark that the person that you were speaking about feels entirely misrepresented. right? It can't happen. And the truth is that we can never really fully know a person to the point where exploration is no longer necessary. I mean, that is true about self discovery. And so it's also going to be true for the people that we love. If you think I'm wrong, and this is what I usually end up saying to this couple, if I put your partner on a first date with someone who was genuinely curious about them, someone who was eager to discover who they are, I can almost guarantee you that that person would walk away with a new piece of information about your partner that you didn't know. Why? Because when we sit across from someone new, we're meeting the person they are today. Like we're listening without the weight of the past. We can receive what they say without silently comparing it to, oh, I don't know, 10 years of history or last week's argument or the role that we've assigned them in our personal narrative. There's no internal scorecard. No, that's not like you. No, you always say that. Just attention and taking things at face value. But in long term relationships, it's rare that we continue to offer each other that kind of listening, at least without effort, right? We have to put effort into remaining curious. And by the way, putting effort into a relationship is not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. I don't know where that came from, but this idea that like the right relationship should feel effortless. Uh, no, no. Sometimes I will say this, and this is a little bit of an aside, but I think it's worth saying. Sometimes people come in and they have just started dating someone, and like right from the get go, there is this grind and this clash. And that is the place where I'm like, hey, wait a second. It's 2.5 seconds into this thing. And if you're already having this much of an issue, like maybe we need to pump the brakes a little bit because this is supposed to be the part that is the most fun, that is almost effortless because there's there's not enough history to have that much conflict. Like what are you having conflict over? And so that is the place where I'm like, oh, like 0 to 4 months, like this should be fun. This should be lighthearted. This should be airy and have just so much levity to it. But over the time, over the course of years, that's going to shift, right? And then we do have to put effort into things, right? So, you know, for my long-term folks who I'm really talking to today, I think we just have to remember that when we stop being curious, we also stop seeing the person who's in front of us and we start relating to an outdated character in our own mental script. And remember, the opposite of passion is not breaking up or a lack of love. It is being disinterested, right? Everyone likes to blame routine, but it's actually the rote disconnection of the, I don't know, proverbial shoulder shrug that can undo us because desire grows in curiosity and in the willingness to let your partner keep becoming new to you, right? Monogamous relationships, and for that matter, almost every relationship will shrivel from a false sense of certainty that tells us we no longer have to be curious. So, what happens that gets us shifting from, these relationships where we are engaged in the beginning to this, other kind of lifeless shell of a relationship that a lot of times people find themselves in? Well, the shift is gradual. It's not all at once, and it's often not through a dramatic rupture, and it's not usually through betrayal or catastrophe. It happens slowly, and it happens slowly through routines, through schedules, through exhaustion, through the weight of shared logistics. I mean, just through modern life, if we're being honest, right? And I think what ends up happening is that a lot of times, a couple is like going through, just kind of grinding through life and they realize like, oh wow, like we still love each other, but the spark, it's either so predictable that it feels kind of contrived, or it's distant, or it's very mechanical. And this is, what we're going to call for this conversation kind of the monotony phase of long-term intimacy. Please notice that I'm not saying it's the absence of love or that it's the death of desire or anything else that's like super dramatic. It's just settling into the patterns of day in and day out. And one of the most powerful ways to interrupt this kind of monotonous phase, it's actually fairly simple. I think a lot of my work, like people think it's, these new techniques are like, oh, we just have to, buy more toys or go away on vacation or, we need to uh, go to couples therapy for years to work on our communication. But actually, what I end up doing with a lot of my folks is something that is simple, fast, and is really effective. And it's talking about, what is a preferred sexual scenario, right? So, of course, with this, we're talking about the spark, with intimate relationships. And I think that there's also probably an adaptation that we can talk about later on for a version outside the bedroom. But the truth is that, we can talk about how to do this for our sexual scenarios. And when people get this part right, when they can have conversations about this and be curious about this, what's really interesting is that sex can often resurrect and inspire curiosity in other parts of the relationship. And this is so counterintuitive because guess what happens with a lot of couples therapy and a lot of couples, books and resources, they treat sex like it's dessert, right? Like after you fix your relationship completely, you can, you get to talk about sex versus what we're doing, which is to say, like, okay, well, maybe part of the problem is that you can talk about everything else, just about, but this one has fallen off the table, and so we're gonna spark curiosity in this way, and then we'll see what happens in the rest of your life. Is that okay with you? Is that okay if we dive into this? I hope so, because that's the rest of the show. Okay. So let's talk again. I want to spend a little bit more time really diving into why monotony happens in otherwise really good relationships and why monotony, specifically in the bedroom, happens in really good relationships. At the beginning of a relationship, okay, sex is fueled primarily by anticipation. Okay, there's novelty, there is uncertainty, and there is also the thrill of being chosen. Like for some people, myself included, there's like a little bit of competition. Okay. And the truth is that even if the sex itself isn't technically extraordinary, it feels more meaningful to most people because it confirms our desire and it confirms connection. But over time, and this is particularly true, talk about, the irony of this. The more secure you are in your relationship, the more susceptible you are to this piece I'm going to talk about right now. Most people will settle into a pattern, okay? And this pattern can often emerge within a few months. After being together for a couple months, like 3 to 6 months, a couple will develop a default sexual script. What does that mean? Well, the same time of day, it's the same initiation pattern, it occurs in the same sequence, and it often has the same ending. Okay. That is your default sexual script. And at first, that can feel comforting, right? It's like, oh, we have our thing. This is really good. But over the years, it can also become very automatic. I mean, like, think about the ways that if you have to drive the same way to work, have you ever just kind of zoned out while you're driving to work and you don't even have to pay attention because you know that you start at your house, you get in your car, you drive down the street, yada, 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 I arrive at work. Well, the same thing can happen in our sex life, right? So it becomes predictable and sometimes it becomes uninspiring. And again, not because there's anything inherently wrong with your relationship or what you're doing, but the script isn't consciously designed anymore. It's just happening. And so we can kind of bleed into monotony. So if you find yourself in this pattern, one of the things that happens is that people don't know how to break out of it because it feels risky. But the truth is that, like, partners aren't clones of each other, right? Each person has his or her or their own desire, right? They have the bridges that lead to accessing that desire. They have their own preferred timing. They have their own sensory preferences, emotional needs, and initiation style. And the truth is that in the beginning, you may not have used your own initiation style or your preferred initiation style because it can be risky to talk about that. And nobody really tells us or teaches us how to talk about sex. And the other thing is that over time, our preferences and the things that feel good to us or intriguing to us can also change. And so, if we ignore the potential differences that couples have between the two of them, sex can become something that you do instead of something that you experience together. So, I'm actually going to walk you through this kind of simple exercise, and the idea is that each partner will answer the questions. And if I was going to summarize this into one question, it would be, what kind of sexual experience do I actually want to be invited into? Okay. This is called the preferred scenario exercise. And I learned it from Barry McCarthy when I was being trained as a sex therapist. And I just think it's so good because it really just kind of cuts through all of the fluff and gets right to the heart of, hey, each person in this relationship is an individual. So, like, why don't we actually, talk about this as individuals? Okay, here we go. Oh, and I also forgot to mention this is an exercise that you do as an individual first. Okay. So, if you were going to do this with your partner, each person designs their own scenario privately, and then you share and implement them one at a time. So, the first person shares, and then they get to implement. Now, when I was doing this training, they said that usually the woman was the one who went first. And I understand why they say that because usually, like, the woman is the one whose pleasure has been more kind of put on the back burner or subverted. But what I would say is, maybe it's the one who feels the least amount of comfort in, like, being vulnerable, and we wanna create the space for them to enter into that first so that they don't feel like they're competing with this, other, like, really grandiose thing from the more sexually awakened partner. So I would say, like, start with the person who it's going to be a bigger stretch if they're willing, because sex isn't a contest. It's collaboration, and so it's not about comparison. It's not about scoring performance or anything like that. It's about collaborating. So here are the questions. Question number one: when am I most open to being sexual? Is it in the morning? Is it midday? Before dinner? After dinner? Late in the evening? Weekends only? Many couples, and this is true in the literature, and this is also true in my experience, many couples default to having late night sex, even though this is really interesting. Nobody ever says that is their favorite time. Like, yeah, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night when I'm exhausted at the end of a long day and I've, like, dealt with all this stuff. Like, yes, that is when I want to hop in bed with you. Right. So, like, that's probably not the answer. So be honest with yourself and don't worry about how the heck are we going to figure this out if my favorite time to have sex is 10 a.m. and you're at the office. That's that is a problem for a different time. Right now, it's just when am I the most open to this, okay? Question 2. How do you like the atmosphere to feel? Do you prefer something that is quiet and cozy? Do you like, a context and atmosphere that is playful and light? What about romantic or a slow burn? Maybe you're somebody who likes, sex to be energetic and spontaneous. You can think of things that might influence that: music, lighting, a shower beforehand, or going for a walk together. Or for some people, it's about time alone and apart before reconnecting. Okay, so consider those things. Question 3 is, how would you like this sexual encounter to begin? Wait, what? Well, let me say it again. How do you want this to begin? What feels good to you? Is it gentle touch? Is it playful teasing? And that can be verbal teasing, or is that, you know, playful teasing with your bodies? Is that a direct verbal invitation? Do you need the very straight and to the point verbal invitation, like, let's go? Okay. Do you like lingering eye contact or a kiss that kind of melts into more? Do you prefer a slow build where you may not be like fully turned on yet, but you're like, you've cracked the door and you're like, yeah, like that's how I want to enter into this. Like I will crack the door and then like you take me there. Or do you like to be kind of like fully turned on because you're having this like spicy conversation on the couch or something like that? And then you move into a different space or you move into different activity once you're like already turned on. Question 4. This is actually more of a series of questions than a single question, but the idea is like we're going to talk about like the flow of the experience. So, once things are kind of underway, right? Do you like taking turns or do you like mutual stimulation like at the same time? When you think about speaking and giving feedback, do you like verbal expression or do you prefer maybe less verbal and more sensory connection? What do you think? Do you prefer one erotic focus at a time? Right? Just kind of like focused on one area, or do you prefer multiple forms of stimulation? What is good for you? Because we also don't want to overload the system, right? Because that can shut things down. Here's another question that I think people forget is actually a question, and that is intercourse, so that would usually be, penis and vagina, if that's the equipment that you have, is intercourse part of the experience for you? Is that part of your ideal scenario? And guess what? It doesn't have to be. It can be something that is a nice to have or every once in a while. It doesn't have to be part of your ideal experience. And if it is part of your ideal experience, do you prefer it earlier in that experience? Or do you prefer it a little later in the experience when your arousal is much more likely to be higher? You're allowed to have preferences here. And I don't think enough people realize that until they're sitting in my office and I'm asking them these questions and they're looking at me like, lady, what are you talking about? Now you're asking all of these specifics. And it's like, yeah, because what you're talking about is actually not just, sex is an umbrella term and there's all of these different things underneath it. And you're allowed to ask these questions and you're allowed to consider your answers to these questions. We got one more. Number 5. Now, this is the most neglected part of many sexual experiences. In fact, even if you're like, hey, we are pros, I don't even know why I'm listening to this episode because we don't have any problems in our sexual relationship. It is so hot, 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 hot. Okay. Even then, I would say that it is unlikely that you are fully exploring the end of this experience. Okay. How do you like things to end? Is that holding each other? Is that talking? Is that having a snack, falling asleep together, laughing, showering, or something else? The ending matters. And believe it or not, like the ending actually shapes how the whole experience is remembered. So you can have some really great, passionate things happening. And if the ending is just completely neglected, then that is typically, it's like recency bias, right? You're going to remember like the last part of it most clearly because it is most close to wherever you are right now. So, really focusing and talking with your partner about how would I like this experience to end? Okay. Got it? All right. So, let me give you an example of two people. And let's see, we're going to call them Maya and Daniel. Okay. Now, Maya and Daniel are like many of the folks that I work with, and probably that you know and are friends with. They're your neighbors, they're your coworkers, they're also maybe you. Maya and Daniel they've been married for 11 years and they have two kids. They both work full time outside the home. They have two demanding careers. And believe it or not, despite all of that, they also have a very organized household. And Maya and Daniel have like a really fantastic relationship, and they're even still having sex. Okay. But they have sex every Saturday night after the kids are asleep. And, there's like quick initiation. There is PIV intercourse, the lights are out, and it lasts, roughly a certain amount of time, no conflict, no drama, but also no anticipation. Okay. And they would be an ideal couple to explore this scenario. Okay. Because when I did this exercise with them, here's what happened. Maya, she followed the instructions. And for her, she was raised in a home which, like most of us, myself included, did not openly discuss sex and, sexual pleasure. And so she was the one that was going to go first. And when she did this scenario, she realized that she doesn't actually enjoy late night sex. By that time, she feels overstimulated, like completely touched out by the kids, mentally exhausted, even though it's a weekend, right? And her preferred scenario looked very different. She was like, I think that I would want this to happen in the late afternoon, right? After a short walk together, we come home to a quiet house. I want 15 minutes alone to reset, and then I want to meet you in the bedroom. I want slow touches, lots of kissing, and no rush, right? Just something that feels like very just flowy and soft. And I want it to end by, us like being able to lie together and talk. And for her, the key words, like the theme words, were unhurried, private, and emotionally connected. Okay. Then Daniel, he did this scenario. Now, Daniel assumed that he was a night person, right? Because for him, again, it's the same couple. That's when sex usually happened. And he was usually the one to initiate. And so, like, very clearly, this was something. And, for him, it was like, oh, well, I started having sex in college and, you know, we would go out to the bars and then we would, like, hook up at night, right? Okay. And so, that happened, and then, like, getting into the working world and, you go to work and then you go to happy hour or you go wherever else it is. And typically, you are hooking up at night. So there was this idea that, like, oh, I'm just a night person because this is what I do. But it was never actually explored. And I think this is so interesting, right? Because for men, well, no, let me start with the women. So for women, women don't get asked these questions because of like purity culture and a lot of other things. And it's this idea that like women are supposed to be pure, right? They're supposed to be uh, not really expressing or having these desires because that means something about them, means that they're a slut or means that they're too much or even too masculine. For men, when I do this scenario with them, what's really interesting is that men have a similar experience of like nobody's ever asked me this stuff, but it's for a completely different reason. And for men, it's like, oh, people just assume that you have already figured this out. Like nobody's actually talked to you about it or told you you're allowed to have preferences, but somehow we just all assumed that you already had this figured out. I just think that's interesting. So when we did Daniel's scenario, his scenario was really interesting. It was actually early morning, not late at night. He wanted no alarms. He wanted sunlight in the room. And I thought that was really interesting. And, like playful teasing under the covers with a slow build. And he also wanted long physical kind of closeness, cuddling, snuggling afterwards. And his like key thematic words were relaxed and affectionate and playful. And I think this is so interesting. And, you know, Maya, for her part, was like, whoa, what? Really? And that was so exciting to me because you could see this like spark and this kind of idea in her eyes of like, who is this person? Like, I want to know this. Right. So, what kind of came out of this for both of them is that neither of them actually preferred the scenario that they had been living. And the truth is that their sex life wasn't bad. It was just a default mode, right? Like it was just like the factory settings. No one had ever asked what actually works for you. And, so I just think that that was like you could just see this blossoming of curiosity again. Now, here's where some people would be like, "Well, wait a second. Their scenarios were different." And like, isn't that a problem? Well, not unless you make it a problem. Okay? So like they didn't argue about frequency or technique. What they did is they started experimenting with each other's scenarios. And out of that process, something shifted. And it didn't shift overnight and it didn't shift forever and always, but the monotony of that routine started to break because now sex wasn't just a routine and it wasn't just, happening at night. Sometimes it was still going to happen at night because there's this whole concept of good enough sex and maintenance sex that we'll have to talk about at some point. But there was just this idea that they were, I was helping, but I was not there. They were consciously creating this experience for the two of them to share. And one time, it would be one person's kind of scenario, and the other time, it would be the other person's, kind of prioritized or favorite scenario, and then probably a mashup of the two along the way. So I really hope that you kind of like this idea because to me, it is so cool. And if I can just say this, like a healthy sexual relationship isn't one where every encounter is perfect. Even the strongest couples have awkward moments and mismatched timing and disappointing experience. What matters is the ability to accept those moments, stay curious, and keep refining what works because desire isn't a fixed trait. It is something that grows when the environment invites it in. And so here's a question to sit with. If your sex life weren't based on habit, but on your true preferences, what would it actually look like? And when was the last time you told your partner? Right? Sometimes breaking monotony doesn't actually require a dramatic change. Sometimes it begins with a quiet, honest conversation about what it actually looks like to invite you into pleasure. And from there, you start building something more alive together. I want to stop us here for today, but before I let you go and I close out, I want to say that if the Intimate Philosopher has become a part of your ritual, I would love it if you would share it with someone that you love or leave a 5-star review so that more people can find this space. And if you want to try the exercise that I just outlined, you can find a done for you downloadable worksheet for free over on my Substack, The Intimate Philosopher Things Left Unsaid. I'll put the link in the show notes, but for those of you listening, it is at substack.com backslash, or is it forward slash? It's the one that leans to the right. So substack.com, I think it might be actually be forward slash at The Intimate Philosopher. If I messed that up, just look in the show notes. I'm so sorry. Okay, so we're going to wrap up today, but I want to leave you with a reminder that love wasn't ever meant to be a fixed script. It is a living practice and a series of conscious choices made in the presence of another human being. So, whether your relationship is shaped by vows or agreements or conversations that only the two of you understand, I just want you to take a moment and ask yourself, what does this structure give us that makes me more honest, more present, and more capable of real intimacy? Because in the end, the goal isn't to be right about the relationship that you have, it's about being real inside this beautiful container that you're building together. Okay? I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining me for this after hours conversation. If something in today's episode made you pause, get curious, or see yourself a little more clearly, share it with a friend and keep that conversation going. Until next time, keep exploring that messy, beautiful space between meaning and being human. I'll see you next time.